and mute myself.
All right.
Should we go ahead and begin, I suppose? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lindsay Graham, and I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, after which I think we're going to go ahead and move directly into presentations, and for the sake of time, we're going to hold questions until the end. Our first presenter is S. Alfonso Williams. He is an independent researcher in Cleveland, Ohio. He says he is neither an academic nor an expert. He has a passionate interest in psychoanalysis, philosophy, theory, the arts, and writing. Scholastically, he received his bachelor's in art history and sociology in 2008, and his philosophical investigations began officially in 2014 and continue into the present. Presenting second is Lindsay Graham, a doctoral candidate at Rice University, where she teaches a variety of interdisciplinary courses. Her research is at the intersection of digital and health humanities, the history of science, and the 19th century literature and culture. And she has published on topics ranging from DH methodologies to the role of archives and storytelling and healing. And our final presenter, and who will likely bring our talks full circle, I think, is Laurent Jarzyna. I hope that's close, Carol. She is a social psychologist living in Chicago. She runs a small research psychology business there, helping clients with all aspects of their social scientific research. This ranges from beginning stages, such as literature review and study design, to statistical analysis, to writing and editing results for publication. She believes the COVID-19 crisis will permanently change the way we live, creating a need for social psychological findings that inform productive responses. Okay, Alfonso, would you like to get us started?
All right, I can do that. Here we go. Right. Hi, my name is S. Alfonso Williams. I'm an independent researcher based out of Cleveland, Ohio. By trade, I work in a library doing circulation. But in my spare time, I do read a lot of psychoanalysis, philosophy, and theory in general. And I just sort of do continuous writing, musing on all of this information and whatnot. I'd like to say thank you to the American University of Paris for putting on this fantastic conference. I'd like to thank Robert Bashara for inviting me to participate. So this will be an interesting experience because I've not really presented before, and it's not usually part of my workflow. So this will be a very positive experiment. All right, so because we don't have a lot of time to lose, I have three pieces that I had already constructed beforehand that I'm going to sort of just read and try to explain a little bit as I go. We won't be able to get into everything, again, because of time constraints, but we'll do the best we can. So to get on to the first piece, epistemology's paradoxes. There is no ethical relationship. The leading principle of the subject's actions is putting the incommunicable subjectivity into non-signifying structures, media, to transfer what is already a substitute for the real thing. So here we're referencing Marshall McLuhan, the content and the effects. So here the content are the elements being transmitted, and the effect is the function of that content within the greater system of transmission. Neither the subject nor other are dealing with anything authentic, which is something neither have access to. However, these subjectivities are volatile and virally addictive. The fantasy reality is the basis for structuring the transference, a simulation connecting fantasies. The simulation fantasy difference will be explained later on in this piece. The fantasy reality is the basis for structuring the transference, a simulation connecting fantasies that induces the contraction of the symptom by both subject and other. So here I'm sort of referencing the nature of the coronavirus within the subjective nature. The simulation acts as a form of passive infection and possession in that what is being passed back and forth through the interface of fantasy reality / simulation combination is somatically triggering and epistemologically engaging / confronting. So basically, this interaction through simulation affects both the mind and body in equally engaging ways. With the mind constructing a simulation from many fantasy reality parts, and the body following through with affective AFF behavior, the logic sense building the epistemology fashions in other of the other, an epistemological substitute of the other that is not the real other. The epistemological substitute is what is possessed by the subject, with the viral infection beginning from sensory perception, continuing through to logic sense to build the epi-twin. So this is a neologism combining epistemology and twin. So what is being formulated here is a construct within the subject's mind about the other. So it is a mediating figure. The epi-twin functions as a cognitive avatar, a user to whom the perceptions of the real other are mapped onto. The epi-twin has no subjectivity, but is what gives epistemological access to the subject in the absence of never being able to touch the real other. So here we're referencing object-oriented ontology, Graham Harman's vicarious causation, objects touching without touching. We're also referencing René Girard's mimetic theory, also a little bit of Jacques Lacan. Desire is the desire of the other, so this intersubjective relationship in needing the other's subjectivity to form that who I am. We're also referencing Deleuze and Guattari in these flows and striations, these networks of relations that take on a more structural aspect as opposed to signifying. The interaction of the subject and other on this epistemological basis then moves into aesthetics and seduction. So the seduction reference is to Jean Baudrillard. Valuations are applied to all of the part objects of the epi-twin, which will mediate and determine intersubjective behavior. Hence, the transference simulations on top of the fantasy reality. However, the intersubjective's dance's purpose, so the dance being the interplay between the subject and other, the dance's purpose is to relate to the epi-twin as opposed to the real other. The engagement between subject epi-twin is authentic, but subject other is fantasy-based on many part objects that pass information along via sense perception. So we're saying here that the subject epi-twin relationship is more authentic between the subject than the subject other relationship, because the epi-twin is being formed as part of the subject's inner experience. So because they can know that better than they can know the other, which is this total alterity to themselves, the total independent singularity, they can relate more to the epi-twin than they can to the real other, which is why the epi-twin is being formed in the first place. The effect, not the content, of this information is what matters most, which is the random mapping of qualities onto the epi-twin. It doesn't matter what the overall effect of the twin is, because the subject will react to it regardless. The subject is just using the twin as a mediating node, a trigger. So like in non-signifying relationships that Deleuze and Guattari discuss, there's still meaning, but it's not signified meaning. Information is just being passed, and what it's passing through, these nodes are just triggering. They're moving the information along without getting caught up in internal meaning. The presence of the epi-twin is what justifies ethical violation. So we're getting into the ethical component of this. Since the twin is never the real other and thus can never synchronize perfectly, the scission always leaves room for suspicion against the real other, which is verified by the concrete limits of subjectivity. So we're talking about the gap that is represented by reality directly. The difference is felt concretely via anxiety and cognitively as presumptions, character judgments, and other empathetic perceptions projections. The ethical is always reactive and never proactive. Otherwise, it is coercion. It is also necessarily defensive against the unethical, who always has the upper hand. The ethical is always deontological in function, regardless of the specific action. It must react on principle or else be unethical itself. So this paragraph here is detailing the nature of ethics and its internal paradox. So basically, ethics is in essence reactive. It's not proactive. When ethics is proactive, it's a form of coercion because I'm expecting you to behave a certain way, which becomes a sort of performance. But the defensive nature of ethics is when an ethical violation occurs, there is a structure to fall back on, which will then determine how the violation is then to be handled. But of course, the question is, well, if the ethical portion is playing a defensive role and the unethical is without restriction, then there's a problem here. The ethical can never quell the unethical without potentially becoming unethical itself. So we're highlighting that paradox, which is the deontological aspect. Let's see, check on time here. All right, 10 minutes in. Okay, continuing on. Deontology serving asignifying functional purposes for ethics means no ethical relations can be formed between subject and other. So long as there is justification to act on or defend against a conflict or grievance on suspicion or concrete knowledge, action must be taken, which is action taken by all subjects in principle. So we're referencing Sartre here. Man is condemned to be free. There's always a choice to be made, even when no choice is actually made. Since all subjects have a choice to act, including abstention, the moment the ethical choice presents itself, it destroys itself, because a subject has to act within ethics to try to achieve a resolution beyond its means. So here again, we're highlighting the inherent paradox, but also we're referencing the famous Russell's paradox, which highlights the problem of a phenomenon being within a set or group and also being outside of it. So this is given by the famous barber example. There's a barber who shaves everybody who does not shave themselves, or something very close to that effect. Ethics inherently functions in the same way. It tries to overcome from within and at the same time stand apart from itself. But again, this is the problem with the unethical component, which is sort of like the independent variable, which is unrestricted. So ethics can't kill it without becoming it and killing itself. So it's a Mobius strip of a sort. This is all represented by the simple statement of what I think of you is more real than the actual you because it is closer to me than you are. We can interject René Girard's mimetic theory or Jacques Lacan's imaginary mirror stage theory as tangential support. So what I think of you is more real than the actual you. So this is the epitome, the idea of the bundles of nodes and connections I'm forming of you in my mind is closer to me than you are. So it's part of my inner experience. You are other, you're out there. So this is forming my ethical relationship to who and what you are. Our purpose for framing it in this way is to lend credence to how the structure of the entire perception discourse is asemiotic or non-signifying in how it intersubjectively functions because of how much artificial simulating has to go on to engage the other. Language is not enough. The subject has to create an entire cybernetic other just to partially engage with them. With all of the mediating properties separating subject and other, they have no choice but to resort to stockpiling data on one another, replicating each other, and hoping that simulation and fantasy match as much as possible. So again, the subject is trying to match the epitwin with the real other And the more cohesion there is between each formation, the less inclined the subject will be to to perform an ethical violation of sorts for whatever motive. The hat trick here is it's not so much the subject is constructing an actual mental duplicate. It's more so that all of the multi-systemic layers of parts gathered from reality to make an ethical decision with regard to the other is information and data flow based. So we're saying here that the subject is basing their ethical construction or their ethical framework based on these flows of data and information that are forming this epi-twin construct that inherently in itself is meaningless. It's just flows of data. It's not the subject itself. It's the mediating portion that the subject is applying subjectivity to. The moment two subjects meet, their limits are established, so they engage in a long, elaborate dance to pretend to act as and be something they're not. But we know ethics doesn't work because once a conflict arises, action becomes necessary to quell it, and so ethics nullifies itself. So here again, the deontological imperative. An action is taken that requires a reaction. If no reaction is taken, then that's still an action that requires some sort of judgment based on the context. Subject needs other to build simulation, but simulation is necessary to locate and place the other ethically. A paradox. So again, the whole construct of creating the epi-twin to form the ethical relation, which then goes back to refeed the signifying subjective aspects of the entire structural relationship in the first place, which is based on pure data transmission. So an important note here for me is that throughout this piece, there's a difference between fantasy and reality. Fantasy, for me, is always reality. There is no real reality. There is fundamental materialism shared by all subjects, but this is merely the grounds for the subjectivity of each subject, heterogeneously different and thus phantasmatically structured because of their own subjective singularity. Simulation is separate from fantasy by not needing to reference fundamental materialism. So the simulation aspect differentiates itself from fantasy, where fantasy is the singularity of subjectivity based on fundamental material relations, and simulation comes in the intersubjective part. So when two subjects engage in relations, this is the simulation, the merging of fantasies, of fantasy realities to create a relationship that did not necessarily exist before and won't materially exist once they stop communicating. All right, 16 minutes in. All right, we're going to try and get through these next two pieces. I apologize if we're moving fast. All right, so the next piece is the trivium, how ethics and semiotics become meaningless. Just like all ethics are deontological, obligatory in function, all semiotics are asemiotic, non-signifying in function. The ethical and semiotic meaning are always determined in the last instance, which is always defensive and too late. So this phrase, determined in the last instance, is a phrase I got from the great Katerina Koletsova in her work on Francois Laruelle. And she traces it to Marx, but I'm using it in a totally different way. But when I was thinking about the trivium, the medieval trivium, and its relation to ethics and semiotics, that phrase by her came to mind. So moving on, mediation is the initial institution of systems between two or more constructs. Instituting systems is itself mediated as institutions, and systems. So we're saying the concept of mediation, of a third element intervening between two others, is what an institution and systems are. This means signification and meaning is always an effect, EFF, of data transfer, perceiving and conceiving information about the environment, and not the content carried along as or in the data. So we're again referencing Marshall McLuhan here with content and effects. Intersubjective relations then are cybernetic constructs mediating data flows. The cybernetic constructs are not subjectivities, but avatars used to engage reality. The subject should understand that their logic and sense is the grammar used to engage the avatar, who engages in dialectics with the real world, and the subject's full-bodied engagement, body-mind, with the environment is their rhetoric, or speaking themselves into existence, if you want to use a metaphor. All of this points us toward the problems of expecting meaning to be where it cannot be found or developed on its own, and misrecognition as a necessary imperative. The subject doesn't intend to misrecognize, but their networking systems force them to, since they are always dealing dialectically with mediated data that possesses no meaning in itself. The data is only the content tool to be grammatically interpreted at the end of the transfer. So referencing earlier, the determination in the last instance, that's where that comes from. The meaninglessness of ethics resultingly begins with grammar and interpreting substitute data that is never the real other. Grammar is then followed by dialectics and rhetoric to complete a cycle of the subject taking in data, assessing it against the environment, acting on it, and repeating ad nauseum. The lateness of this entire process, as opposed to meaning being preconceived and ready at all times, means the trivium cannot generate an ethics or semiotics that does not cancel or violate itself. The trivium instigates a Mobius strip within the subject that is not necessarily linear, but a process whose product is never separated from it. The trivium product as extension reabsorption acts as an extension of humanity, McLuhan, that will act as a screen where new art forms will be created and engaged as reality itself. So in this last sentence, McLuhan always talked about new art forms, new media, obsolescence, old media, and the old media become art forms, which are then subject to all sorts of grammatical interpretations. But we're also, just in general, relating the entire interpretation process, the fact that there is a process, that there is a beginning and an end point, itself makes necessary, it places ethics in a particular position to where, as the subject determines their ethical relationship, they've already framed the subject in a particular way and determined all sorts of meanings and significations that premeditatively determine how they're going to act. Okay, so again, I'm going to breeze on to the third piece. Capitalism, ethics, and ideology, subjective roles. Where do capitalism, ethics, and ideology stand in relation to epistemology? Epistemology is comprised of logic, sense, grammar, intelligence, dialectics, and rationality, rhetoric. These interact within three layers of reality within knowledge. So we're calling this onto-epistemological. So knowledge, which is based within the structure of reality. These interact within three layers of reality within knowledge comprised of the biogenetic, which is the body, existential, which is intersubjective and environmental experience, and ontological, which regards being and knowledge. So the three layers are biogenetic, existential, and ontological. The subject relates to the world through artifacts, systems, and tools, which are essentially media, institutions, and technology, which integrate them into the environment. So the subject is being mediated by the artifacts, systems, tools, media, institutions, and technology. Capitalism is an extension of subjectivity in the form of a structural system that integrates the subject into a system of information, data, but in a non-meaningful way, so non-signifying way. Capitalism allows for many organizational forms of information, both material and immaterial, which refeed back into subjectivity. So here we're differentiating between essentially the capitalistic subject and the formation as a political economy. We're saying that they're coming from the same source, which is the subject. But the extension of the subject through artifacts, tools, media, and the environment itself, these are both of the same source. Ethics is the surplus artifact of subjectivity that is ineliminable. Ethics' purpose is to bridge the gap between epistemology, knowledge, and ontology, being. The cost for this, however, is the introduction of innumerable deadlocks within subjectivity that are unsolvable. Ideology is the viral symptom as an effect of epistemology and ethics combined. Ideology is an external projection of epistemology back toward the subject as an institution. An institution here is being defined as a standalone entity apart from the subject. It is self-relation from the outside, an example of Russell's paradox of trying to be both inside and beyond itself simultaneously. Ideology perceived as an effect of capitalism is as data production. It is part of its structural components. Ideology also taps into the addictive and repetition compulsion aspects of subjectivity that makes its viral character so potent. Capitalism and ethics and ideology are all extension effects of epistemology, which is responsible for how the subject relates to the world. They are all extensions. Capitalism as external system is necessary for epistemological guidance within collective groups. Ethics is the regulatory component within the capitalist or whatever political economy system mediating what is and isn't allowed to manifest intersubjectively. Ideology keeps the subject in check through fixating them on particulars and universals that stabilize the system. The subjective problem with all three stems from this desubjectification, deadlocks, and self-subversion arising simultaneously within the subject's productivity. The more socially productive the subject, the greater incidences of these phenomena, which grow into endemic syndromes, and these syndromes, as I see it, are four. They are culture, politics, religion, and society. So, check time. Okay, 26 minutes. All right, so how does all this relate to coronavirus? Coronavirus is, in this context, is what is informing epistemological relations. So everything that we talked about from how the subject forms a bundle of relations within their own selves, which relate back outside to the external phenomena. The epistemological formation is the core source of what they'll use to relate to the world. So if we wanted to relate concretely to articles in the news, so there was an article on April 15th, 2020 by the BBC, coronavirus, Amazon boss Jeff Bezos adds $24 billion to his fortune. Basically, Jeff Bezos come about? So we're saying that it's not just capitalism. There's a dual system of signification and non-signification that arise together, which then brings with it ethics and ideologies that allow for the formation of a Jeff Bezos. So it's not just that of his own will he decided to build this massive fortune and profit in a time of immense loss. There's a system in place that allowed him to do it, but the system is not. It's not a formal separation. The political economy that allowed him to do this was instigated as part of the subject's subjectivity and their epistemological relations with their environment and everything that flows through them as extensions. So we can also go to another more recent article by the New York Times, May 7th, 2020. White House rejects CDC's coronavirus opening plan. Again, like the Jeff Bezos deadlock, here is another deadlock, another ethical deadlock. The White House, or Trump, for whatever, selfish political reasons he has, is deliberating between wanting to open the economy against the lives that would be lost in the process. But in conjunction with that the entire framework of that decision is problematic, because either way, the constituency will be the ones who will suffer. So no matter which side is chosen, so whether the economy opens up and then people's lives are lost, or the economy is closed and then the economy tanks, which then causes more loss. So either way, loss is the product on the end, which was the product of epistemological formations. So I'm realizing I'm out of time. Thank you again to the American University of Paris and Robert Bashar for putting on the event and allowing me to participate. I'm looking forward to all the presentations that will then that will be coming forth in the next few days. And thank you so much. All righty. Thank you again. Was it Lindsay going next?
Yes, thank you, Alfonso.
All right, thank you.
So we're actually going to pivot a little bit away from COVID-19 with my talk, but I think that in the Q&A section, we can probably bring these different threads together. Let me get this done. Crisis response, digital disaster archives is activism. On January 12, 2010, a magnitude 7 earthquake shook the island nation of Haiti. In a space of 12 days, 52 aftershocks buckled the land and sent water pouring over the beaches and bursting from riverbanks. Haiti's colorful, vibrant gingerbread houses and Port-au-Prince, architectural markers of its post-colonial history, crumbled. Food and water resources were immediately scarce. The International Red Cross arrived, as did Doctors Without Borders. Countless others followed. The homes, history, and heritage of Haiti, the health of a people, seemed in the hands of humanitarian disaster response organizations. Increasingly, national history and cultural heritage are threatened by global climate catastrophes, as the Haitian earthquake attests. But the paradox of disaster is that it can also transform space into a place of heritage through memorialization. Those historic gingerbread homes, for example, have recently been named a protected heritage site and attract numerous tourists, even as the labor of reconstruction continues. These post-colonial homes are greater than their physical objective presence. They are, the home of the community's cultural, intangible heritage. Within their walls, for example, the art of Haitian folk dance is practiced and stories are shared. While the building's exteriors reflect a historic moment, phenomenologically, their interiority is a moving, fluid site of embodied experience a space of ontological significance that challenges the perception of the world as static object. Intangible heritage upended by disaster, like the Haitian folk dance or local stories, needs a protected, preserved space, even if it lacks a definitive place. Heritage organizations have long grappled with issues of preservation and sustainability following large-scale disasters. And recently, digital disaster archives have come to fill a void engendered by immediate geographic instability, bound with a desire to safeguard cultural memory and the collective experience of the people. This talk will thus examine the potentialities of the cyber environment as a sustainable site for preserving intangible cultural heritage, particularly through the creation of digital disaster archives. Here, I will examine the role of oral storytelling and its digital incarnation as an integral site of healing for Haitian communities following the 2010 quake. I will argue for a decolonized digital archive modeled upon the dynamism and exchange underpinning oral traditions, and ultimately claim such participatory space functions not only to nurture cultural heritage, but also through its vital function as a witness, the digital disaster archive emboldens humanitarian activism and fosters sustainable communities. This talk thus responds to Diane Barthel-Boucher's call to expand our understanding of heritage as not just responding to societal conundrums, but as helping to resolve them. Donna Haraway has argued that we should, quote, privilege the kind of witness possible from the view of those who suffer the trauma of not fitting into the standard, end quote. Therefore, in order to create effective coping and long-term recovery strategies for those impacted by climate disaster, an approach to heritage that moves survivors from the periphery to the center of their own stories is essential. My talk will proceed in 3 parts. First, a discussion of disaster events. Next, a brief overview of Survivor to Survivor Haitian Memory, which is a small-scale ethnographic project created in response to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti. And then I'll argue for how we preserve oral histories through archives. In short, I want to suggest that digital archives are how we as a global community, separated by time, space, and experience, can connect to the needs of others in times of disaster and recovery. Too often, the material devastation of a disastrous event belies the obscured temporality and spatiality of disaster and recovery. Yet when we attempt to temporally define disaster, says Kai Erikson, quote, we find ourselves looking backward in time to moments well before the official beginning of a disaster, and often discover that its true origins are to be found far back in the course of history, end quote. Those Haitian gingerbread houses, for example, did not crumble from the quake alone. Rather, homes and businesses collapsed due to a lack of infrastructure and lack of resources spanning decades. Similarly, speaking to disaster as extending beyond the present and engendering a precarious future, the renewal of the historic gingerbread neighborhood simultaneously marks other sites, perhaps less visible ones, as simply too difficult to be recovered anytime soon. Certainly, restoring the gingerbread neighborhood is important, but it is worth mentioning that as those colonial homes were being rebuilt, thousands of displaced people lived in makeshift tent cities such as Cité Soleil. 4 years following the disaster event, Cité Soleil remained a maze of blue tarps, cinder block shelters, and dirt paths. Another unsettling paradox of disaster is that while it has a nebulous and complicated temporality, it is also unequivocally time-stamped. January 13th, 2010, the day following the quake, 1 out of 6 Haitians were physically displaced. As evinced in those tent cities, climactic events can instantaneously transform a tight community into a diaspora. Both spatial and spatializing, disasters divide neighbors and devastate entire neighborhoods. Disasters uproot communities and families. And fundamentally, they suspend an individual's understanding of personhood in the world. Disaster affects the human body itself through physical trauma and pain. but so too does disaster distort a person's subjectivity through the body. In Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty argues that the subject, the I, constitutes herself as the center of perception and movement, and it is through her body that she relates to other bodies in the world. From a phenomenological perspective, then, the force of an earthquake radically distorts the survivor's sense of self as an embodied, knowing subject, a subject who makes meaning through his or her movement in time and space. When one's movement through space is violently upended, as during an earthquake, meaning-making at the ontological level is severely arrested. The very spatiality of disaster despatializes the survivor, impedes her ability to organize and relate to the world. Even for a body that escapes physically unscathed from an earthquake, the landscape's radical and violent transformation tangibly constructs human mobility, degrades perception, and ultimately thwarts the survivor's sense of spatiality. In those moments when the earth buckles and shifts, the survivor's status in the world also shifts from subject to object. No longer is that person's world one that can be organized through movement, relationality, and most importantly, choice. In the very minutes that the earth quakes, the world is arbitrary for the subject. Post-disaster, the world is strange and disorienting. In post-quake Haiti, the loss of the physical sites, wherein people constitute themselves as a community, inflicts yet another layer of trauma, cultural trauma, and further erodes a survivor's sense of self. In time, though, survivors reconstitute themselves through this uncanny space shared with other survivors. Recovery, like disaster itself, extends in time and space. Recognizing the impact of environmental disasters, folklorist Carl Lindahl seized upon his own experience as the co-director of the U.S. project Surviving Katrina and Rita in Houston as a model for a Haitian-specific humanitarian response to the 2010 quake. He understood that survivor-to-survivor connection is one of the greatest benefits to people following a disaster event. The survivor-to-survivor interview technique used in his Houston-based project allowed survivors not only to document their experiences of devastating hurricanes, but it also revealed community building and systems of kinship formation across and around the disaster itself. Based on the oral tradition, this oral history project, Haitian Memory, offers a particular model of healing as it provides a means to make survivors more active agents in their own recovery. In brief, Lindahl's Haitian Memory Project was designed to allow survivors of the earthquake to take the lead in documenting their own experiences before, during, and after the earthquake, and is structured to aid in the participants' short and long-term recovery. In this model, trainers and interviewers receive compensation for their time, thus providing immediate financial stability for individuals. This is a key factor in short-term disaster recovery. The project additionally provides translatable job skills, such as knowledge of transcription or communication strategies, all skills that bolster long-term recovery following disaster. Further, interviewees benefit from the healing act of telling their own stories and connecting with other survivors. Thus, Lindahl's project should be seen as a multi-layered approach to recovery that promotes cultural heritage while proffering a path to economic security, skills training, and social bonding. It is heritage preservation, I think, that truly seeks to preserve the values and the daily activities of the people. The personal stories from the Haitian Memory Project often narrate the heroic actions of ordinary Haitians as they recount neighbors helping neighbors. And the collection debunks contemporary images of the country as a geography marked by weakness, primitive conditions, and disease. Post-colonial theory has done much to highlight not only the dehumanization of the other, as justification for colonial abuses of power, but also points to the multifarious ways similar tactics continue today. Paul Farmer has studied the violent impact on Haiti emerging from centuries of misrepresentation. By pathologizing the nation and its culture, he says, locals absorb the blame for the condition of the nation, and those foreigners are able to absolve themselves, their governments, and international global politics of any wrongdoing or part in the current economic and social justice situation. Haiti, however, has a rich history of resistance to these dominant Euro-American images, and this legacy of colonial resistance continues in the narratives collected by the earthquake survivors. Far from helpless victims, Haitians depict themselves and one another as strong, as fighters, as survivalists, and as entrepreneurs. And their narratives effectively record the internalized struggle for freedom. The stories shared between Haitians reveal the fortitude, not the fragility, of a developing nation. In fact, resistance to dominant narratives circulating in Western media outlets about their experience during and after the quake is a hallmark of the survivors' interviews. But so too are stories of community, and community formation is integral to short and long-term recovery following catastrophic events, as victims of disaster report greater feelings of security when they're able to draw on both economic and social capital. Through the very act of coming together to share their stories, social networks are expanded, and these new communities are thus more capable of providing security and stability. These networks are crucial in the months and years following disasters that displace people from their homes, their places of worship, and their employment. Recreating, both in memory and in person, those severed social ties is integral to healing after trauma. While the vast majority of archives are marked by the erasure of a colonized community, a decolonial archival project, such as I envision for Haitian memory, is doubly predicated upon recovery. First, it aims to recover the voices of the marginalized population of Haiti. It makes Haitians more active agents in their own recovery following disaster. It also represents the present and, importantly, the decolonial future of the nation by providing a bottom-up local perspective and the creation of an archive of narratives that runs counter to dominant historical descriptions of Haiti in similar post-colonial nation-states. The archive may be now contemplated from the perspective of a decolonized future, or the conditions of possibility under which such a future may be envisioned. The International Council on Archives further describes the ways in which archives meaningfully contribute to just societies and, quote, quality of life. Central to the Council's claim is that open access to archives furthers a more just society. Open access to a material archive where, for example, photos and recordings of interviews documenting the Haitian experience of the quake would need a location to be housed. But where would a physical Haitian memory archive be kept when roads and buildings are at best fragile in urban areas and non-existent in remote regions? Currently, Haitian memory does not exist as a digital archive, though it utilizes digital technologies. But now, as Haiti rebuilds roads and expands broadband connections, it seems that a digital archive and its unique affordances, including open access, would best suit the needs of this project and could build upon that face-to-face community formation initiated in Lindahl's peer interviewing process. Indeed, the digital realm and technologies have greatly altered the scale and scope through which we are able to understand both historical records and accounts of the present. If an archive of Haitian interviews is transformed into a digital archive, we could witness the growth of Haitian and international community building, insofar as a digitally based archive allows more people to tap into the wealth of Haitian heritage. For example, international humanitarian workers and researchers could learn about the medical needs of the earthquake survivors and potentially compare this archive of survivor narratives to other local survivor-narrated archives. Researchers and policymakers might, through computational analysis, trace historical patterns of local needs at a larger scale by consulting and examining various post-colonial and survivor-centered archives. And this information may provide a trajectory of disaster recovery from a unique first-person perspective. Digital technologies, including archives, have the extraordinary ability to connect people across the globe and across time. The social and political ramifications of such an extension of community network would dramatically alter the way that humanitarian response is fashioned. The digital afterlives the first-person survivor stories would, or should, do much to change the dynamics and composition of participation at the policymaking tables across the world. It is only by ensuring that survivors have a place within the political global community that we can more accurately meet their needs in times of trauma and in the critical months and years that follow. Ideally, this temporally and spatially expanded network would increase the resources and resiliency of the local community. However, though the existence of an archive authorizes and legitimizes the history and heritage that it contains, it always exposes power structures, even as it attempts to overturn those very same structures. When considering the potentialities of the digital realm in particular, we are necessarily confronted with its limitations. Who, for instance, would create the digital archive, build a platform to host the recordings and transcriptions of the Haitian Memory Project? Who has the authority to curate the materials, and to whom does it belong? Ideally, a project concerning Haitian cultural history and heritage would be based, even in its digital format, in Haiti and run by locals, as this is at the heart of a true living heritage project embedded in the present and in the community. An employee at New Life Children's Home in Port-au-Prince, where I stayed, expressed that Haiti had more cell phones than potable water, and that internet access available through those cell phones had revolutionized daily life. He also shared, however, that it was exceedingly difficult to have reliable internet through a computer, a somewhat necessary component to building a digital site. And despite the fact that 55% of Haitians have smartphones, their internet connection is often interrupted due to availability or expense. Furthermore, space is still an issue in the cyber world, despite the fantasy of the unending expansiveness of the digital frontier. The 250 recorded interviews to which Haitian Memory aspires to collect must be hosted on a server. And unless one has access to an institutional repository with a dedicated server, often server space comes with a hefty financial commitment. Though far from novel, this speaks to major debates currently facing digital humanists. Who has access to the supposed democratic space of the internet? Often, developing areas lack the resources to truly tap into and exploit the potentialities of the digital. Thus, the issue of turning to the digital to house the Haitian Memory Archive exposes the disparity of resources that plague post-colonial nations. Though the bottom-up perspective that the original Haitian Memory Project espouses is potentially in tension with the top-down perspective of an archive housed or promoted by a U.S. academic institution, the stories emerging from the project epitomize the feminist standpoint theory of situated knowledge, a specific form of knowledge about the world that highlights the way in which knowledge is culturally and socially constructed. Through the sharing of their local situated knowledge, Haitian survivors become epistemic agents, active producers of knowledge concerning their culture and status in the global world. Further, as witnesses to the survivor stories, through the creation of a digital archive, visitors and policymakers alike can open themselves up to the perspective of the other and interrogate their own response and their own responsibility to act. By maintaining a contradictory or split perspective, one that sees through the standpoint of the survivor as well as through their own frame of reference, visitors to the archive become accountable in some ways for producing new forms of knowledge of non-Western populations. Scholars have noted, in disaster situations, the first responders are local people and local communities, and they are also the last responders, and often the last to be responded to. Yet it is in these communities and through their networks, both dispersed and proximate, that relief, rehabilitation, and revitalization occur. Phil O'Keefe describes this local-driven response to disaster as, quote, an economy of affect, end quote, wherein we might understand the local environment as one of giving and receiving. Affect extends beyond the immediate response to disaster, though, and also includes what he calls memories of trauma and lessons learned. For a digital disaster archive to collect and display these communal memories, it is crucial that care be at the fore, care in terms of caring for the stories and for the people who share their stories. Polyvocal and diverse, a decolonial model of a digital disaster archive is one that is created by the local people, is responsive to local needs, brings the global into conversations around local care, and addresses local heritage as integral to well-being. A dynamic, participatory archive such as this is marked by openness to new stories and to new community members. It is also marked by the agentive power of silence. The power to remain silent, to deny one's voice to another, is crucial to maintaining the agency of local people. A participatory digital disaster archive fitted to the oral tradition, then, is one that is in fact not wholly open access. Through scaffolded access, the archive may protect against global consumption of the local community, while its very construction concretizes that community's authority to speak for itself in the global landscape. It is also important to remember that an archive of this kind has the potential to serve as a platform where contributors and visitors alike can discuss their shared experiences at sites of historical trauma through the creation of an online community forum. An archive underpinned by the same theories of exchange, of giving and receiving, as is seen in the oral tradition itself, truly performs the role of the living institution. Despite the hurdles remaining, the participatory decolonial model of a digital disaster archive, one that follows the principles of Carl Lindahl's Haitian Memory Project, I think serves as a public witness to the present lives of Haitians, while it also serves as a witness to the effects of climate disasters writ large. Understanding historically marginalized populations through a variety of technologies promises not only to recover the voices Western history has neglected, but provides an immediate framework for well-being. This is the penultimate goal of many recovery projects, but I want to suggest that a digital disaster archive of oral heritage has the potential to stretch our concept of disaster recovery itself and its connection with well-being. As an active space of social solidarity, the digital disaster archive can and does shape our experience of and desire for real, experienced global space. In a way, then, it is a site intimately bound with changing the politics of place. Digital cultural heritage is not about preserving a singular moment in time, but about preserving the dignity, the rights, and the communities of our world. Okay, Carol, are you ready?
Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Jarzyna, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm honored to present among so many experts in so many different fields. Given the interdisciplinary nature,
Carol?
Yes. I'll introduce my field.
We're not seeing your screen. We're only
hearing.
hearing.
Okay. How people think, feel, and act in relations with. Hello, everyone. I'm Carol Jarzyna, and I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm honored to present among so many experts in so many different fields. Given the interdisciplinary nature of this conference, I'll introduce my field, social psychology, by saying that its focus is how people think, feel, and act in relations with other people. As a science, it relies just as much on empiricism as do the biological or physical sciences. Being that COVID-19 just erupted in March, what I have for you in the empirical realm is mainly observation. What I aim to do in this presentation is review the psychosocial responses I've observed to the pandemic and its ensuing quarantine. Judge how helpful or positive they are, and based on that, advise response for the second wave of COVID-19 and future pandemics. Because I've been quarantined too, my direct observations are limited to the US, and the majority of my talk relates to the American response to COVID-19. That stated, I'd like to start with what I call the bad responses to COVID-19. These include rallies to protest the quarantine, hoarding of items deemed essential, and widespread sharing of misinformation. Let's start with the rallies. Under normal circumstances, political activism is a good thing. It gives people a voice and an opportunity to influence policy by demonstrating what citizens passionately desire. In times of viral infection, however, there are far better means of activism because the cost of a protest is so great. By the nature of a rally, many people gather in close proximity to one another, in direct violation to the social distancing guidelines set forth by epidemiologists. On top of that, many protesters defied the recommendation to wear face masks as a statement of protest. Add to that prolonged speech, and you've got a hotbed of viral activity that may well cause a spike in cases, and thus the need to reinstate the very quarantine those gathered are protesting. To make matters worse, some healthcare workers joined in, understandably, to protest the protesters. These workers at least did so from their vehicles and wore face masks. However, healthcare workers are more likely to have been exposed to the virus, and if contagious, spread it to others. Those healthy might then contract the virus from the gathered protesters and bring it to the most vulnerable groups when they return to work. It's unclear what the beneficial outcomes of these rallies are. In most states, it appears they didn't affect the length of the rallies as they aim to do, or the length of the quarantine as they aim to do. In one state, Wisconsin, protests as expressions of public opinion may have influenced the state's Supreme Court to reverse the governor's rule. The court reopened Wisconsin sooner than health officials advised, and Chicagoans and the state's own pent-up residents ran to the restaurants and bars to celebrate. However, Wisconsin and other locales that opened prematurely have since shown spikes in the virus. So most of the rallies didn't achieve their explicit goal of changing quarantine length, and those that did may have deterred public health. What rallies likely caused was a feeling of collective effervescence, a term sociologist Emil Durkheim coined to describe the bubbly, good feeling of togetherness you get when you gather around a belief. It's a good feeling, but not a good result. Alternative means of causing change are available. Petitioning elected officials or media-assisted forms of expression, such as writing opinions for the news or having representatives state your group's desire on television, would likely be more effective and better for public health. Another response to the pandemic that was not beneficial is that of hoarding essential items. The pandemic naturally caused anxiety, and this directs humans towards self-preservation. Having necessary resources is crucial to survival, so people want to ensure that they have them. And related irrational thinking may lead to the overestimation of one's need. When people feel others may benefit from resources and they may not, panic sets in and paves the way for hoarding. We might hoard items that fight the virus like masks and medications, or just basic hygiene products that we think will be scarce. While buying a lot of a commodity for oneself wouldn't usually cause a problem, when most members of the society do it at the same time, it creates a decrease in supply and an increase in demand. Even individuals who weren't particularly anxious about having enough of a resource now note that it's decreased and buy more than they normally would have, entirely depleting the commodity, as happened with toilet paper. Psychologists call what has happened here a social dilemma, because one's self-interested behavior has conflicted with the interest of one's group. When one or two people do it, there's no problem. However, when most people do it, the depletion creates what we call a commons dilemma. With toilet paper, this is an only inconvenience, but when you consider that the same thing happens with medications and personal protective equipment, it's clear the results are serious. The law of scarcity actually factors in here as well, because this is related to what we usually call nowadays FOMO, or fear of missing out. People's primal urges are most activated when they perceive that others are benefiting from something like hoarding and fear that they won't. Principles of interactive decision-making, however, and game theory show that there are mutually beneficial courses of action. If society were educated on this, more folks would show restraint and the situation would probably improve. Even if it didn't, minor forms of regulation that have already been enacted, like stores capping the amount of a commodity allowed by one person, those have shown to be effective. Another bad response is denial at both the government and personal level, caused by conflicting goals. In this case, the goal of protecting physical health conflicts with the goal of protecting economic health. Acknowledging the extreme negative effects of COVID-19 and recommending quarantine greatly impedes the economic health of a country and its individuals. On a personal level, a person may be experiencing job loss, pay cuts, and loss of child and health care. In the face of such devastation, we may even lie to ourselves, succumbing to a state of actual psychological denial. Governmentally, the U.S. president has been criticized for recommending that testing be limited. Since a decrease in testing leads to a lower discovery of COVID-19 cases, people may erroneously conclude then that there are fewer COVID-19 cases. In China, there has already been greatly insufficient testing, according to many reputable news sources, and some scientists believe the nation could be putting the rest of the world at risk by misleading them. A nation claiming they have decreased cases when in fact they don't have sufficient testing just means that they don't know how many cases they really have. Limits on testing is in direct violation of guidelines from the major health organizations, who say more testing is one of the most important factors in flattening the curve. Perhaps related to denial, much misinformation has been spread pertaining to COVID-19, particularly to the contagion, severity, and treatment of the disease. On social media, many armchair epidemiologists have appeared, advising others on these issues without sufficient knowledge of science and medicine. Often, inaccurate recommendations about critical health information is shared. There seems to be a very strong human tendency to assume that if a friend shares something that he or she says is fact, then it is a fact. In actuality, that friend might just be resharing what someone else assumed was fact. In a related vein, conspiracy theories are being embraced now more than ever in the US. We must stop operating on assumptions and intuition and rely more on education, critical thinking, and evidence if we are to combat this and future pandemics. The last major bad response to the pandemic lies in the idea of herd immunity. And I want to note that of the bad responses I review here, many people would argue that whether those are good or bad, that some people might think that a rally is a good thing. People disagree on this, but I'm going generally with the scientists. I'm going entirely with the scientists in my perspective. So scientists have disagreed on whether herd immunity is a bad idea or a good idea to combat coronavirus. And this pertains to herd immunity in Sweden. While most major health organizations advise against this method, some epidemiologists believe this is the best way to approach the pandemic for some populations. Herd immunity means that 70 to 90% of a population is immune to the virus because they've either been inoculated against it or they've had the disease before and it's a disease that you can't get repeatedly. Once that level of 70 to 90% is reached, there's a low risk to the remaining 10 to 30% of the population that don't have immunity to it. This approach has its strengths. An advantage is that a quarantine does not have to be invoked and any ensuing economic downturn would be minimized. Nor does the population have to endure the negative psychological effects of long-term social isolation. However, there are many shortcomings to utilizing herd immunity, especially without a vaccine. Certainly the best way to utilize herd immunity is when you have a vaccine, which of course we don't. For instance, most experts agree there is not a full understanding about reinfection with coronavirus. Because of the way other SARS viruses have behaved, it's unlikely that one can become reinfected with coronavirus. However, some countries have initially provided data suggesting that might not be the case. Also, some groups, like children, don't fare well if they have a lack of immunity and dwell in an area of herd immunity. And finally, since a large percentage of the population is still getting the illness, There will be a great number of deaths and complications because the fatality rate for COVID-19 is so high. Sadly, Sweden's predictive models now appear to have underestimated fatalities, particularly in their nursing homes. Choosing the herd immunity approach means you must predict and prepare to the best of your ability. You must have enough PPE, hospital beds, respirators, medications to minimize dire outcomes for the infected. In some nations, this may work better than others. For instance, in Sweden, the population is relatively low and many live alone. So it's a good candidate there. They are not a country that lacks resources, medical or otherwise, and this is part of the reasoning that factored into their decision to utilize the herd immunity approach. In contrast, this path was not recommended in the US, with a considerably larger number of highly populated regions and a lack of preparation and supplies. While the criticism of Sweden is warranted in many respects, I do think that a bit of cultural relativism is useful here. Rather than have an ethnocentric view of the situation, it's legitimate to note that the rationale that went into the country's decision it was a good one. Hindsight being 2020, it's easy to point out flaws retrospectively. However, their response was reasoned, led by experts, and pursued to protect economic and perhaps psychological health. I note psychological health because Sweden is unique in some important ways here. The country sits so far north on the globe that a significant part of their winter means the sun doesn't rise for several days. There is a much limited period of light and sun exposure during the winter months, and the cold temperatures are so extreme at times they make it difficult to go out. Coming as it did near the end of the Swedish winter, a pandemic quarantine for Sweden would have meant over a year of some social isolation because of the quarantine, and then the quarantine that the physical environment necessitates. Their winter, followed by a quarantine now and then another winter, adds up to a year and a half of some social isolation or quarantining, presenting a serious psychological threat, especially when concomitant with the economic downturn that probably would have ensued. While many hypothesized that quarantine and vaccine development would have been wiser, really more time and research is needed to know definitively. There are a number of other bad outcomes to the coronavirus that I won't have time to get into, but things like decreased school hours has probably increased online gaming and other types of screen time for our youth. Scams have increased. Phone calls targeting the elderly, selling fake insurance and treatments have all taken root. Given these responses to the pandemic, what's on the other side of the coin? The positive responses to COVID-19 are many and remind us of our adaptability and the good parts of human nature. These give us a loose template for directing our future actions. One of the best adjustments society has made to the pandemic lies in working from home. While technology has already increased the ability to work remotely in the last 10 years, the quarantine has forced us to completely jump into this endeavor, and we've done fairly well with that. In-person meetings, group calls, and as we are evidence of, even conferences can transpire in a quarantine. Zoom, an app that allows virtual meetings, has allowed workplaces, schools, and social groups to convene remotely. Giving lessons in a sport, a musical instrument, and various other areas can all occur online. These virtual experiences may not be as efficient or bring as much of the human element as in-person contact, but especially for things of an informational nature, they're quite a good replacement, at least for an interim. They decrease the amount of travel, fuel, and time we need to get to and from work, which creates more time to actually work or to be with our families. We've transitioned to the workplace, the virtual workplace so well in such a short time that many large organizations say they will continue to use it extensively once the quarantine is over. I've been fortunate enough to be attending an overlapping conference earlier in the week called the Becker's Hospital Review Conference. And there, Scott Becker and some other individuals projected that ways of communicating during the pandemic, like working largely from home and using telehealth as a big thing in the medical field, that will be relatively permanent and to our favor. We need to look for the unexpected positives and try to utilize them in the future. Technology hasn't brought just the workplace home, it's brought recreation too. Museums, libraries, and musical groups have offered everything from art, books, and concerts online and free to the public. Though I'd rather see the Mona Lisa at the Louvre, we can learn and feel a lot by having these things brought to us. It may even be preferred at times for people who live in distant places or who have a disability that may travel difficult. The fact that they have been offered for free says much about human generosity. Of course, these offers weren't completely selfless on the part of the institutions, but were in large part acts of kindness. We might generically refer to these types of actions as helping behaviors, and indeed they are. In social psychology, we refer to doing acts that benefit others as pro-social behavior. So many pro-social responses to the pandemic have arisen to meet the needs caused by the virus, be they physical, financial, social, or psychological. While the work of first responders and healthcare professionals is so essential that these folks expose themselves to risk in order to provide for others, the quarantine has meant that many people cannot work because the risks outweigh the need for their work. Others are fortunate to be able to work and thus earn an income from home. However, they may be now doing so with an infant and toddlers by their sides because daycare is closed. All three of these groups face a significant challenge, and so many individuals and organizations have acted pro-socially, doing what they can to help these groups. Governments are providing economic stimulus packages to provide for financial needs around the globe. In the US, a stimulus bill was passed to generate checks for those who have lost their jobs due to the pandemic, and businesses were given some tax breaks. Germany and France proposed a large recovery fund financed by borrowing on behalf of the European Union to help those most affected by the pandemic. And on the private side, individuals and organizations have stepped up with donations. In the US, religious groups have provided even more shelter than they usually do. Food banks are experiencing increased lines for the essential products that they give out to those in need. In Illinois, there's something called the Illinois Arts Alliance, and they've provided grants for musicians who have had to cancel gigs for quite a large amount of money. So all of those great things. Online photo sharing platforms have advertised aid programs to assist photographers worldwide. And on the very individual level, many people have chipped in their talents to sew protective face coverings to combat the paucity experienced by healthcare workers. And you'll often see, in addition, folks with multiple carts at the grocery store buying food not just for themselves, but for their elderly relatives or compromised individuals. Since one measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable, it's great to see so many people looking out for other individuals. Far from suggesting, as one politician did early in the quarantine, that vulnerable people, particularly the elderly, should be willing to risk serious illness so that we could keep the country and the economy running smoothly, most Americans have shown great care toward older and otherwise vulnerable populations, not the least of which have been children. In that regard, educators have made quick adjustments to bring learning to our young people. Just as real business meetings have turned virtual, so has going to school. Necessity has more deeply forged the path toward online learning that started at the beginning of the millennium. Like e-meetings, e-learning may be inferior to learning in the classroom in some ways, but it's beneficial in others, and again, likely sufficient for the interim. Parents and students grateful for it have erected signs and even made videos thanking teachers for helping them learn online. Little ones who even haven't entered school yet are affected by the quarantine. They can't go to the park and run with their friends, nor can they have play dates with their buddies. But parents have helped them communicate with one another the old-fashioned way. Kids are creating art at home again now. And if you walk through any neighborhood with lots of children, you'll see the signs they've created in their windows. Greetings to friends, pictures thanking doctors and nurses, and rainbows. Rainbow hunts require children to first make their own rainbow using crayons and construction paper, and then canvass their neighborhood recording where and how many other rainbows exist. This is a fun respite for preschoolers stuck at home with parents who are working home all day. In a similar vein, the stuffed animal safari is sweeping the globe. Check out this hashtag on social media and you'll see the world's citizens placing googly-eyed, cuddly stuffed animals in their windows, yards, and even alleys to create a safari for toddlers to spot while walking through their neighborhood. The Girl Scouts of America even held a contest for the best presentation of a stuffed critter. as well as an award for the most pictures posted of animals which kids spotted. Indeed, gratitude for educators, essential workers, and others has been expressed copiously during this time. Many cities have designated dusk as the time to gather on balconies and blink your lights, hold up signs, and generally make some noise to thank essential workers. We've also embraced new types of camaraderie. We now have drive-by birthday parties. Italy led the way with folks singing and playing musical instruments on their balconies together. Chicago followed suit and had a balcony John Bon Jovi sing-along. Online, people share jokes, memes, and even alcoholic beverages, zooming in with their friends to enjoy a quarantini during the quarantine. Though we've likely increased our screen time, we've also returned to former uses of our time, like playing games with our families, enjoying sports in our yards, and going on nature hikes. I may have even cleaned out a closet. Given what we now know about all of these responses, both good and bad, what can we do to prepare for a second wave of the coronavirus or another virus altogether? I believe the best way to prepare is to analyze what has worked for us and let our experience guide our future behavior. Public education regarding guidelines and their rationale will be foremost in combating misinformation and general response. The recommendation to critically consider information is just as important in this endeavor as the dissemination of truthful information. Another crucial element will be learning how to come together during this time of ample division, especially in the US. We've been divided for the last several years, and this is no exception. It's really only gotten worse. Fighting toward a common goal with an army divided on how to do so is a formidable task, and Americans at least have not done well with that so far. Research on interactive decision-making, game theory, these show mutually beneficial decisions that exist and can be used. Again, a public educated on these outcomes will be more likely to pursue them. This may be a little bit of an optimistic view, but in the past, public health initiatives have educated societies successfully, many times, such as with the AIDS crisis. And they will likely be effective now, given some time. Finally, we should look to the unexpected benefits that new normal yields. For instance, remote work has already improved commute times for people who work traditionally. It's decreased pollution already, and it may improve the environment long term. Eliminating travel times gives us more time for actual work or family time. We have embraced a return to a lot of healthy activities, like exercising outdoors instead of at the gym, or playing games with our kids at home. We need to adopt the good parts of social distancing wholeheartedly if we are going to endure the bad. In closing, I believe that if we accept this new normal, commit ourselves to public education, and find a way to operate effectively through division, we will largely recover from this pandemic and handle the next one in a much improved way. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Wow, that was cool. That was very cool. I like how both of you talked about paradoxes. Lindsay, in your presentation, I liked how you pointed out how I think you said 55% of the constituents had cell phones, but water, natural resources were severely lacking. So that to me is exactly what I was conveying in different ways through my talk. How at the level of signification, you have different competing signifiers between what the subject thinks they need, what the institutions think they need, and then there's all types of meaning and discourses that circulate around that. But at a different level, it's still the institutions who have control over a lot of these resources. So with respect to the natural resources, the constituents can manipulate them, but they're not responsible for their overall determination in terms of policy. So because they don't have the agency over that, because that's the responsibility of the politicians and the government managers, they're sort of excluded from that conversation. And so then the government is sort of allowed, not just government corporations and all those institutions are allowed to do a bait and switch type of deal. So we'll satisfy you with this, take this with the other hand while you don't notice, and then leave you with nothing. So so yeah, that definitely struck me right there. That was extremely problematic. And then Carol, with you, what you pointed out with the protesters, they're at the same time that they're engaging in what they believe to be a socially responsible act, you know, confronting these agents directly, they're also simultaneously disregarding all the health rules that have been put in place. So they're sort of, in a way, they're castrating themselves at the same time that they're putting their agency into effect. Again, like another strange paradox. So for me, that all falls within the domain of epistemology. You know, how does the subject take the information that they know within the tunnel of experience that they can't really escape? They only know what they know, and then put that to work. But at the same time, as a subject, you have access to this thing called imagination. Imagination is like the wormhole that allows you to get out of your own experience. You know, I can't physically be the other subject. I can't be you. So my way out of that is imagination. So I try to pretend epistemologically what it might be like to be in your situation, encountering the effects of that you might be experiencing. And so that's what I received from both of your fantastic talks. That was awesome.
Thank you.
I think they were saying that we only have.
Alfonso, you actually have a couple of questions in the Q&A if you'd want to take a look.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, Q&A from Vanessa. Oh man. Okay. Oh man. Okay. So she typed, "Thank you, Alfonso, for that wonderful presentation. I love how this piece tied in with the very first presentation this morning by Fu Wai. If you didn't get a chance to hear it, highly recommend it. He also spoke about simulacrum via Baudrillard and hyperreality as being laid over reality and eventually being assumed as a substitute for it. Reminiscent of the way you described the transference relationship being overlaid upon the real or intersubjective relation, and how this can be seen and applied not only in dual relations, but societally, and how people bring our fantasies, simulacrums together to create new worlds. When I consider interactions in this way, it gives me hope that we can create a better world together. Also, your points about ethics are essential. I'd love to hear more about them." Yeah. So, man, there's so much underneath all that. We already have the tools that we need to transform our society. Everything is already there. At the same time, the simplest thing to do, which is change your mind, seems to be the most difficult thing to do. And we have ideology discourse that unravels, you know, all of the pieces and parts that go into how we make these decisions. We can look to, you know, Slavoj Žižek and Frederick Jameson, who've written books all about ideology. And so we have all of that, but yet it's difficult for the one subject to just change their mind and say, okay, this is what we need to do. This is what I need to do to be responsible. So it's extremely complicated. What do you guys think?
I think, just to logistically point out, I think that we're going to move to a Slack channel in a moment. I just want to throw that out there. in case anybody needed to set that up.
Yes.
Okay.
I saw that. Should we move to Slack?
Yeah, so that'll
Yeah,
be like the
sorry, because I typed that in. You still have a few more minutes, and we can go like 2 or 3 minutes over time. That's not a problem. If you
Okay.
still want the discussion after the panel is over, I can create a Slack channel for you, and then you can put more thoughts into Slack then on top of that.
Sorry.
okay. Okay.
Alfonso, I thought it's really important what you said, that we have all these things at our disposal, but the hardest thing to change is our mind, is anyone's mind. I know a fair amount of social psychologists who've devoted their career to studying how people change their minds and what we can do to make them change their mind. And particularly now, a lot of those psychologists are political advisors or do political research. And they don't have the answer, and they've been trying for a long time. I know that some of them feel that we don't really ever change people's minds, or we might, but it's to an insignificant degree, and that the only way change really comes is almost, well, it's through time, but generationally. For instance, if you tried to persuade my grandparents or great-grandparents against some forms of racism 50 years ago, you'd be talking to the wall. But if you look at people my age and my children and my nieces and nephews, they totally don't see it that way, and they've married interracially. And so what was so hard to do at the individual level just happened naturally at the generational level. But I think you're very right. It's very difficult to change people's minds, and we can't begin to know it. We haven't begun to know about it.
Yeah. Man. Any other thoughts?
You do have one more question waiting for you, Alfonso.
One more question. Oh man.
They're all for you. Lucky you.
I know.
Oh man.
Just want to make sure you saw that.
Let's see. My question is for Saul. Robert. Oh man, this man changed my life. Robert is awesome. My question is for Saul. What is the significance of agency in your structural account of subjectivity and ethics in the context of COVID-19? My purpose in pointing out all these paradoxes was to highlight how autonomy and agency already incorporate certain built-in contradictions that define it. So you can't get rid of the paradoxes that we see between the individual and the constructs that they create through media. There's no separation there. The subject is always in the environment, and the environment is always in the subject. But when you have a singularity like subjectivity within this kind of context, there's these anomalies that begin to spring forth simply because of the way of its ontological nature, just the way it is. And then when you start multiplying subjectivity, beyond 1, 2, once you introduce the 2, you've already established an ethical relation. So now the subject has to take into consideration what this anomaly might do against their subjective field. And then it just sort of multiplies from there. So everything that is constituted within the one subject becomes reflected outwards in a way, and forms all these complexity networks that creates responses that they can't deal with. So I don't know if that answered the question, but there's so much more that goes into that. So, oh man, it's 5:03. I guess this means time is up, but if we can get the Slack channel going, we can definitely answer all the questions that you would like. So I would just like to thank Robert, the American University of Paris, for offering this fantastic 11-day conference. I got to see and hear people that I never would have gotten to hear otherwise. being here sandwiched in Cleveland, Ohio. So it was good to hear all these amazing talks, all these amazing speakers, Lindsay, Carol. There's no other way I would have been able to get around the world to hear everybody's contributions on these subjects. So I'm eternally thankful for being able to participate.
And Alfonso, I think you said that you have not done a lot of presentations in the past, and this is a fantastic job you did. You're a natural.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, this is definitely my first one. I've not done anything like this before, so I was looking to you guys to try and model. But,
this is my first virtual conference, so in some ways this is new for a lot of us.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, this was definitely a learning experience. So I'll take this and move forward and try and do the best I can. So I guess we close. Oh, hey.
I just want to say, well, thank you for your presentations. Slack is a bit of a pain with creating channels, so we'll take a few minutes, but I'll set up the Slack channel, and the question that is in the Q&A right now, I'll put in there as well, and you can keep discussing there, keep asking questions, the attendees, and you amongst us, yourselves, of course, as well, and the discussion can keep going there then.
All right, cool. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I'll see you.